We're ready to get started. So this session is being recorded, and I'm now on the grid view, but very soon I will switch to the speaker view. So today we have the pleasure and the honor to have Ursula with us. And Ursula, as everybody knows, is one of the most admired pianists of the last 50 years. And she has collaborated with many of the most important composers of the 20th and the 21st century, including John Adams, Luciano Berio, Carla Bley, just to name a few. With 5 Grammy nominations to her credit, Ursula established her reputation early on with a classic recording of Fyodor Dostoevsky's The People United Will Never Be Defeated, among many other recordings. And she's a professor at Mannes College and a distinguished professor of music at Brooklyn College and CUNY Graduate Center in New York City. And today, Tony will be interviewing Ursula. So I'll pass the mic to Tony.
Thanks, Ayun, and thank you, Ursula Oppens, for being with us today. I have to say, you're one of my personal heroes, and I've been fortunate over the years to be able to participate in coachings with you and get one-on-one your perspective on a number of things, but then also to hear you live and have conversations about music and the things that make us all, that bring us all together here in a place like Soundscape. And so thank you for being with us today. And I wanted to ask you a little bit, just tell us a little bit about your background, how you got started, and where did the insatiable desire for the new come from?
Many different answers to that. My parents were immigrants from Europe, and they mourned the culture that they had left. At the same time, I have a membership card that my father joined ISCM, International Society for Contemporary Music, in 1946. So there was always this interest in new music, though they didn't express it. They expressed nostalgia for Europe. But of course, by the time they were here, so was Bartok, so was Schoenberg, so was Stravinsky, so was Hindemith. So the music that was right around us was actually the great music of our time. There are other reasons. One of them was I had quite dogmatic piano teachers, and the only person who could trump the piano teacher was the composer himself or herself, who could tell you how he or she wanted it. And that was a powerful incentive for me. I also was sort of delighted to find composers of more or less my age, very often just a few years older, right around me, and I could work with them. And one of the great early influences on me was the violinist Rosemary Harbison, who was married to John Harbison. And so I remember doing some of my first Bartok and Schoenberg with her. And this was at Harvard, where there was no performance program at all. But there were composers. So if you wanted to hang out with musicians, you hung out with composers. And so there were all these different reasons to get involved.
When I think of composers with whom you are inextricably linked, there's 3 names that come to mind immediately. And of course, that's Shevsky, who we heard about earlier from Ayun, Elliott Carter, and Conlon Nancarrow. These are, when I think of your legacy, these are the 3 composers that come to mind almost immediately. And there are many, many, many others. But can you tell us a little bit about the music of these composers that you have played, what your process was with them, how each one was different, and what what the synergy that you felt with the music was.
Difficult question, fun question. I think for me, Elliott Carter would be the center, because I first heard the name Conlon Nancarrow from him, and I pretty much first heard the name Frederick Rzewski from Helen Carter, who said he was spending too much time babysitting his children and not enough time composing. So that I really think. Now, Carter's music I first came to know as a high school student. I was in Aspen, and he was there. I didn't meet him at the time, but the Juilliard Quartet played the second string quartet and also did a lecture demonstration on it. And I think this was the summer before, probably the summer before I went to college. And the lecture demonstration really was what was the most important part of it, because they, showed us how it was built. And it was so exciting. And I think that really was the turning point when I became interested in Carter. I didn't play anything of his till 5 years later, when I was at the Marlborough Music Festival, and they had gotten a grant to do American music, but weren't doing any, and then found out that the Carters were planning to come and visit. So they were desperate, and they had to organize something very quickly, and every other pianist there was better than I was, because I hadn't had any lessons in college, mainly. And so they asked everyone to do, this piece was the sonata for flute, oboe, cello, and harpsichord. And everyone good said no. And then finally I said, could I try? And I remember the first day I was reading the piece, and I played a wrong note, and I didn't like it. And then I noticed it was wrong. And that also was sort of one of those explosive things, that my intuition didn't like what he hadn't written, And that basically was the beginning of my playing his music. He came, I don't remember anything about the performance itself except being in a state of pure panic, but apparently he thought it was okay. And a couple of years later at Tanglewood, they were in a similar position. They had programmed the double concerto for piano and harpsichord and 2 chamber orchestras, and couldn't find someone to play the harpsichord. And again, they asked all the better people. And then Carter suggested me, and I knew the piece from having heard it, because my boyfriend of the time was Richard Fitz, a wonderful percussionist, and he had once had me sit between the percussionists in a rehearsal of the piece, because it's a piece with a fantastically virtuosic percussion part for 4 percussionists. And that also was one of those experiences that change your life, So that's how it started.
So I'm really interested in the idea that you couldn't tolerate the wrong note, and that you had an intuition that this was, when we're young and we're learning things, we learn wrong notes all the time, and even when we're old and we're learning things, it happens. But you have this instinct. I know, like for me, Messiaen is one of those composers. You would think in all of these clusters, if there was a wrong note, it wouldn't be that big of a deal, and it's like everything is off if one harmony isn't exactly right. And so I mean, can you still, with Carter, with pieces that you don't know, like when you're coaching a string quartet, for instance, do you still hear that wrong note and just have the sense that this is not Carter?
I can't say with certainty at all, but sometimes, and as I said to Tom earlier, I'm trying to memorize some of his pieces that I haven't ever tried being by memory, just because we have time now. And certainly there I know if I play, but I know the piece. If something's wrong, I don't think. I mean, especially in a in a string quartet, possibly, or there are notes you look at twice. They're even very often I get very early versions of, I mean, not ones he's working on, but the first printing. And they have mistakes in them, and usually they're pretty identifiable, but not just because they sound wrong, but because they don't quite make sense, notationally.
Notationally, or in terms of the spatial relationship, the time relationship
Yeah.
of how things unfold. In terms of time, this is what I think of with Nancarrow, right? That these machines that he built from these piano roll, this notion of piano rolls, these things. How does a pianist negotiate mechanical time and human time in Nancarrow? And thank you for providing us with the canons. I would love to play those so that everybody has in their mind an imprint of your sound on this work, but also Nancarrow if they don't know it.
Yeah, that's why I thought of all the things that would be sort of fun to play. That would be it. Well, when Nancarrow, one thing I found about the canons is that they're very much written for a human being. They are not mechanical, and was very exciting. Of course, various people have done transcriptions of the piano rolls. The Bugala-Williams duo and Thomas Addis are the sort of ones, and I think their transcriptions are fantastic. But these pieces that Nancarrow wrote are basically idiomatic. The difficulty was in the canon I didn't send to you, though, which is Canon A, which is 5/7. And that's not a rhythm that we have learned before. I mean, you probably have done it. And I don't hear you.
But I only have to sing one note at a time. You actually have to do the polyrhythm. I just have to, fit it in with some other people.
Okay. But I remember sort of just being flabbergasted and then saying, okay, you have to stay in the room with the music and you can't do anything else. But that has a name to it. And then on about the third day I was doing this, I thought, well, I'll just divide the measure into 35 bits. And that's
as one does, right? I mean, when that's like step one, is to understand kind of mathematically what's going on, and then to kind of, fit the things together. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? I mean, just to have that feeling going on, right? So it's like we all do the same thing. You have to start slow and like micro, right?
Right, and you're teaching your body to do something it hasn't done before. And your body wants to do what it already knows. So you have to be very careful not to let it do that, I mean, I'm sure that happens as a singer even more than as a pianist.
Yes. I mean, yes, that's what happens to humans who are trying to learn any new skills. I think we really default to what is familiar.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm sure everyone here, everyone listening, does that all the time, is learning something that you couldn't do before or that you didn't even imagine doing before.
Let's take a moment, if we would. It's only about 6 minutes long, to listen to this canon, and so that everybody really has a strong image of your playing. And when I think about this piece, and I listened to it a little bit earlier today, and the directness of your sound is something like we would always know it's Ursula playing and not somebody else, right? And then I got to thinking about concerts that I heard a few years back when you were doing all of the Beethoven sonatas, and you did a cycle of them at Northwestern when I was there. And I want to talk to you about how sound from the present era informs sound from 200 years ago. But
Wow.
for the moment, let's take a listen to you playing this canon. Let me get my screen set up.
I can play it from here.
That's extraordinary, right? It's an extraordinary piece and it's an extraordinary performance.
Well, it's a real fun piece, and other pianists play it. I mean, it's entered the repertoire. It's not an intermediate piece, I wouldn't say, but
No. There's something about Nancarrow, not just this piece, but many, many other pieces. I find such joy in the music. And I'm sitting here listening to this. It's like, okay, is it just like the collision of whole tone and major, right? Is that major key? Is that the thing that's doing this to me? And it's like, no, there's something about the way things fit together and the effort, the energy that it takes to make that happen. There's an effervescence about that. And for some pianists, it sounds just hard. For you, it's just like sunshine, right? It's just explosive in that way. And I adore it.
well, you find the same energy in the studies for player piano. And, they are really fun, most of them, just wildly fun to listen to.
Yeah. And so that question about sound,
Yeah.
right? One of the things that I noticed, so in Nancarrow, you can't make a traditional phrase or phrase off of things in the same way that you would in Brahms or Beethoven or something like that. And so the thing that it seems really important is the length of the note, how long you stay in the key, right? And the quality of the attack. And how has your experience with this music informed and changed your relationship with the canon, and especially Beethoven, because you've done so much Beethoven and had a real commitment to this throughout your career? And in fact, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that you really view yourself as somebody who has both feet planted in past and present quite equally. And so what's that dialogue between past and present for you?
Well, I don't see it as a time difference because I think each composer has his or her own sound. And even composers of the very same time and so it's really not past vis-a-vis present, though present does certainly a lot more exploration with non-traditional sounds. But this piece is all on the keyboard. It's in that sense very traditional. Of course, Nancarrow also had a foot in jazz. So, and I hear that very much in this. And as you know, especially with the studies, most of them really do make you laugh at the end. They go, and then it's over. So that was part of, he himself was laconic would be the word. I remember he was here for a New Music America festival, and he managed to do an interview never answering with more than one word. And he must have done it on purpose.
Right. So you mentioned jazz?
He was a jazz teacher.
Right. And for you, what's your relationship with jazz music? Did you play a lot?
I cannot swing, but I've played quite a lot of music written by composers who are both jazz and classical composers. I mean, like Anthony Davis and Julius Hemphill and Anthony Braxton but I've been on their square side, and I once was in a piece of Julius's, and there were pages and pages and pages of written out piano music. So I thought, this is up my alley. I can do it. And then there was a movement with not a note written, and I was supposed to play. And I hadn't the slightest idea what to do. So I wish I could, and I would sort of recommend for younger people to spend some time learning changes, because the more types of music you can do, the more you bring to every single piece you do. So
What did you end up doing in Julius's piece?
The others carried it. There were other people. And I never did anything again. I mean, I looked like
But did you find a way to
I found
fit?
improvising to know that when you don't know what you're doing, do less. And, so you don't ruin it for everyone else. So that helped.
And maybe also part of that is if you're doing less, you're listening more, which probably increases the quality of what it is that you do.
Exactly. So but we should be doing that more as part of our. I mean, I notice here in this festival, there's a lot of it. And one thing I sort of wanted to say about this particular interview is when I first met Tony Arnold, you were taking a course that I was teaching with the composer Bill Carlins, and it was called Composer Performer. And you wrote a wonderful piece for it. And so this has been something that has been a thread for quite a while.
Yeah, it has been, and it's been amazing. And then also around that same time, Ursula was coaching the duo, Jacob Greenberg and I. We've been longtime collaborators, and we kind of started that journey when Jacob was doing doctoral work at Northwestern. And I remember some very intense sessions. And what I loved is I felt like I didn't know what was going on at all in some ways, but you and Jacob knew exactly what was going on, but there were only 3 or 4 words spoken at any given time. And so like there was this energy, and it was this kind of pianist's energy in a way, but it was also like, it was the Jacob and Ursula energy too in the room. And it was amazing. I felt like I learned kind of so much by osmosis and by this kinesthetic energy. And it's a particular energy that pianists have, and that really fine pianists have. There's something about it. I remember it's a totally different thing. A recording session that I did that had, it was a piece of Tanya Leon's, and it was for clarinet, violin, and piano 4 hands. And the communication that was going on between the 2 pianists was something that was constant, and it was something that none of us understood what was going on. But there was something, it was all kinesthetic. It was almost no words at all. It was broken sentences, broken phrases, kind of like George and Marta Kurtog when they were working together and speaking to each other. It's like all of the phrases were somehow communicated in the arms. I don't know how.
I don't know either. Many of my best friends are pianists, so that is something. And Frederick Shevsky wrote a 4-hand piece for me and my partner. And the end of the first movement, he has us go all the way on top of each other, underneath each other, to the bottom of the piano, and then to the top of the piano. And then I noticed that even Mozart has pianists doing 4-hand playing on top of each other. So it seems that what you're talking about is something that composers have noticed since time immemorial.
Right, and all of the Kurtog pieces are, of course, deliberately gestural, where everybody's crossing in each other's spaces. It's not just his original pieces, but also his transcriptions of the chorale preludes, the Bach chorale preludes. Are very special voicings, and everybody's in each other's space all the time. And there would have been an easier way to transcribe it, of course. A much easier way to transcribe it where everybody's on their own part of the keyboard, but there's something necessary about the complication.
Yeah. Well, there is something about, yes. I mean, as I said, having noticed that Mozart also does that, It must be the first thought that comes to a composer's mind when they write for piano forehand.
Do you like playing piano for hands?
Yes, I do. But you have to play with someone you like.
Yes. Have you ever played with somebody you don't like? We don't have to mention names, but what was that experience like?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't. I don't remember, but I really don't think so. You know,
That's good.
I've done a lot of two piano work, and I think some forehands with Aki Takahashi, and that's been also absolutely wonderful. And Frederick and I have done a lot.
That's great. So you said about teaching. You started teaching, you said kind of relatively late in the game.
I met you basically.
So how has teaching changed you and changed your playing?
It has made me sort of get very interested. I mean, in terms of the music itself, of understanding that certain things, I call it almost an iconography of music, that certain kinds of motions have meaning, like the descent. That's always a lament, and things like that. One wants to just talk about and make sure. I mean, that's really part of how music is built. I try not to interfere too much with my students. I mean, I try to find what helps them just find a path the best. And that's partially, in a way, just goes back to my first answer about why did I get involved with new music, is that I felt the only person who could supersede what the teacher said was the composer. And I don't want to be that kind of a teacher. I want to be a teacher who actually helps the student find their own way.
I imagine that a lot of that has to do with the questions that you ask or open for them, or the way that you invite them to make their own questions.
That's wonderful, yes. I mean, I would like to do even more, much more. Yes, that's the way to teach. I mean, you must be a wonderful teacher.
I like everything else. It's always a fine line, and there's always a moment when the best laid intentions start to get in. It starts to get in my way as a teacher, let alone, I mean, I'm sure everything's in my students' way that I do. But it's the teaching is humbling.
Yes, I mean, the main thing is I feel that all my students play better than I do, which...
You know, that's what Ida Kavafian said to me a couple of years ago. I went out to Angel Fire, which is her festival, and you know, I thought I was gonna sing some things with her, but she assigned all of her students to it, and she goes, they all play better than me anyway. and you know, we all feel that way, and I think that there is something that's true about, certainly about technical acumen, and I think that there is something about this, that as generations proceed, and especially now with recorded technology, there's such an awareness of what has come before, and people are so inspired by what has come before. And young people, I mean, all humans, right? We learn by patterning. We pattern ourselves on others, and that's I didn't want to use the word imitation because that sounds cheap, but patterning is something that, like, that's how humans learn. It's how humans progress. It's what we all do. And so when we know that certain patterns are possible, we can assimilate them quite quickly if we
Well,
know it's possible.
I read once, this what to do with the Second World War. The biggest secret about the atomic bomb was that it could be done. Once it was done, it could be imitated. It could be.
Yeah. And so I think that it's very true that our students possess, coming in, probably better technical acumen than we did.
Oh yes.
Than we did at that time, and then we amass a certain thing, but then at a certain point, I've come to understand more as I've gotten older that there is something to wisdom, there is something to experience, and that it doesn't make me smarter or wiser or any of those things, but I know myself better. And so I know how to direct my energies to interface with the musical material that's in front of me to make that the most productive that it can be. And that those paths, those currents become very kind of well worn, and that's kind of what makes the grain of an individual performance. It's like that's what makes me know it's Ursula's sound, is because you have worn that path in a way that particular path in a way that nobody else could.
I did a path, the only thing about sound, I mean, the most important thing about sound are your ears, because you have to listen to what you do. But the other thing that I've found is the most important thing about playing is to be really as lazy as possible. And
really, tell us more.
well, to try to do things, I mean, if you aggressively attack the piano, it basically will fight back. To produce a sound, you must as a singer do that. You produce a sound as in the most relaxed fashion you can. I mean,
applying the most precise effort and no more.
Exactly.
Only what's necessary.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's somehow been with me since I first played. I don't know why I got that way, but once you do that, there's no incentive to work harder than you have to.
Do you find yourself having to remind yourself of that from time to time?
My left foot gets tense, and then I can tell that I'm tense. But which is why I don't do well with an iPad.
I'll remember to tell my students that they should check in with their left foot to see if they're too tense.
I think we're getting fine.
Yeah. If there are questions, we should probably open things up. You can add them in the chat if you want to, or raise the digital hand, because then I think we can see you.
Oh, there's lots. Oh.
Yeah, and then I'm gonna just say something that you said to me the other day to kind of open this up. You said, "Soundscape is exactly what I've been doing all my life." So
Yeah,
this,
as I said, I think things have changed really in the last 25 years, because I think the idea of blurring the distinction, are you a composer, are you a performer, are you an improviser, I think we are getting out of the assembly line where you have to be one or the other. And that's really changing on a wide scale, and it's very exciting, and I've found that to be true of at least half or more of what I've heard this week. That people, and it's been very exciting to me.
Are there questions? Victor.
Yes, thank you. Professor Oppens, I remember one thing you said just a moment ago. I think you mentioned Bach and crossing hands. And you mentioned how often interesting it is that some so-called extended techniques are things that have been around for centuries. But more often than not, I hear that meant as a defense of extended techniques, as if this stuff kind of needed to be defended against detractors. I don't know, personally, I'd rather just celebrate it for, like, it's just like, I don't think it needs that level of defense. I'm just wondering of your perspective on that.
Let's see. I think what I was trying to say is that composers were doing some of the same things always, but that some extended techniques they've been only doing more recently. But I don't think it's a question of defending or anything.
Yeah, I didn't interpret it as you defending it. I was just seeing how people often use it. Yeah.
I once heard a Haydn string quartet where the players did the whole second half of a movement pizzicato, and I don't know whether that was how it was done at the time or it sounded absolutely beautiful. But that was the first time I thought of even an ordinary pizzicato as an extended technique, though you have it on the guitar. So I don't know.
Interesting to see how these techniques have a lineage way farther back than we imagine, I guess. Thank you.
Other questions? Tom.
Hello. Let's see if I can formulate this question. I mean, thank you so much for talking with us today. It's been so interesting. I mean, you, as Tony was saying, you play all music, and you don't see any distinction between, all these composers, which seems so natural and so wonderful. But sometimes pianists get pigeonholed as, oh, that's the pianist who does this. He's a new music pianist or she's a new music pianist. And maybe that's okay to be pigeonholed in that way, but have you experienced that, and has it been positive and or negative, and how do you deal with that, or have you dealt with that,
Well, I have to say I've been very, very lucky in that the people who helped me in my life and career really encouraged me to do everything. I'm talking starting with young concert artists, actually even going back further. I remember taking a lesson, waiting for a lesson with Rosina Levine, and she was giving a lesson to Edward Auer, who was playing the Carter Piano Sonata. She said, "Oh, I'll call Mr. Carter and you can go play for him." So that was Rosina Levine saying, "I'll call the composer, go play for him." And so I've always been surrounded by people who were very positive in this way. I think it's the stupidity of others when they want to pigeonhole you. I think even if maybe you feel less confident about playing Beethoven or Schubert, I think it's very important to work on it yourself, because most composers know the music of the past. And even when John Cage was saying he couldn't stand Beethoven, he had a very strong relationship to him, and to play John Cage, it's good to know Beethoven. And so it's just a question really of trying to be as much of a musician as you can be, but don't let others say don't do it. That's the main thing. I mean, we're talking to a number of younger people, and you might have older people saying, "Oh, this is what you do best, forget about the other." Don't listen to them. Do everything.
I think Raquel, did you have your hand up?
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Tony. Yeah, just a quick question. I've been thinking a lot about just the idea of just practicing for practicing sake, you know, just practicing not necessarily to prepare for a performance. And I just, you know, especially in this time, I've just been really enjoying practicing piano. It just feels like a catharsis in this time. And I was wondering, you know, if you could paint a picture of what practicing is like for you, like what that experience can be sometimes, of just sitting at the piano just to love it, you know, and enjoy it. What that's like for you, and what that might entail, what pieces, how your fingers tend, you know, to gravitate towards.
Well, I like, what do I like? I mean, I like trying to focus my mind. And one of the things about practicing is when you do something over and over again, some people might say, how can you stand doing it over and over again? But actually, it's a little different every time. And the main thing is you get better at it. And that's really fun, you know. So even if I practice less than a certain amount, I find my fingers get more stiff. And as I also forget, as I learn things steadily and I forget things steadily, and I want to keep the learning ahead of the forgetting, you know. So, but it's really the thing of concentrating my mind on something I know how to do, you know. And some years ago, I started jogging a bit, and I found it very much the same experience, that I started being terrible, and you know, each time I could get a tiny, tiny bit better. And it felt similar, you know. And I think this idea of doing something over and over again, mindfully instead of mindlessly, is basically what we love.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Austin?
Hi. I first just wanted to say I'm a big fan of a lot of yours and a lot of your recordings. And I had a couple of questions about how you sort of approach the interpretive process, and the similarities or differences between if you're learning the work of a later composer, or a composer already passed, or a composer who's alive. And also, if you have a little bit of time, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your background studying with people like Madame Levine and stuff. Because I noticed that oftentimes with some of her lineage, it's like there's this thing about sound for the sake of sound in the tone of the piano that is just like, it's this unbelievable like thing, and I find it really present in your playing, and I'd love to hear a little bit about that as well.
Okay, would you give me a second? I want to close the door to this room because there's about to be music in the other room. So I'll just be right back. Well, actually, I feel as if I learned to read music by learning pieces I hadn't heard before. I mean, as a child, I grew up, both my parents were musicians, and I must have heard a great deal of music without even knowing what it was. So when I'd start a Beethoven sonata when I was, let's say, 15, I'd heard it already 100 times. So that made me less careful about trying to figure out what's there. Again, just as I was talking about with a complicated rhythm, your body wants to do what it did before, and you have to really not force it, but, you know, say, no, you can't do what you did before. You've got to do this new thing and learn it. So I feel, even with interpretation, that it's best not to come with any preconceptions to a piece, you know, and then gradually, such as with Nancarrow, you think, my God, this is so funny. Or, you know, and then you want maybe, it's a dry humor, not a, or, I mean, with Beethoven, sometimes it's very complicated. I mean, sometimes he writes more of the same markings that you really than you want to do, and you have to figure out what will work, what does he want, and you experiment. You know, you can't do the same, let's say, crescendo to a subito piano 5 times in a row. So you have to, but you can't ignore that it's there either, and so you get sort of, you have to think about it, you know, and you also have to think about large sections of a piece, that they make sense and hang together so that people, because you're doing something to speak to someone else, and what you say has to make sense to them. And so I do find that for me and for students, and I hope for an audience, just being really certain of what the structure of a piece is, or having at least your idea of what it is, helps a lot, you know, because, I mean, just like the development in sonata form, you're wandering about, you're lost. And in fact, very often in classical sonata form, you even get a recapitulation, but it's in the false key. So, you know, and these are sort of jokes of a certain kind. So you sort of, whatever the music means to you, but you try not to approach it with an idea. You try to get the idea from it.
Are there any other questions? Dylan.
That's a good question. Thank you for the interview. I really enjoyed it. So I'm kind of different from you in a respect, because my background, like, as a musician, is like as a jazz musician, primarily. So when people put like scores and things in front of me, my first instinct is like, okay, like, how does this fit on the guitar, and then how can I take these phrases and flow away with them and things a little bit. But my musical practice has always been like more difficult for me to sort of like just sink my head into like one sort of piece and like get all the way through it and, you know, and perfectly interpret it and all these things, you know. And that's something more recently I've just been working on. I wonder, like, I mean, one question is like, I wonder what you think about when you get a new score, especially if you don't know the piece, like, how do you figure out ways in which you might want to interpret it? And the other is like, have you noticed, like, with different composers who have like slightly different backgrounds, do you notice like different ways that they like treat the score and how you might interpret it from that?
Oh, lots of questions at once.
Yeah.
First of all, there's no such thing as a perfect interpretation. And in a way, I hope a little bit more like a jazz musician. For instance, in chamber music, you rehearse together, but then when you come to the concert, what you've rehearsed is how to respond to what the other person does. So it may be a little bit different from what you did in the rehearsal, but you know how to respond, which is what you do in jazz, I think. And of course, in jazz, people play the same tune hundreds of times and it's always different. And in a way, it seems to me that the separation of classical music and jazz is a little bit artificial. I mean, after all, everyone improvised until very recently, you know. I mean, Beethoven improvised. Liszt was a great improviser. Chopin was a great improviser. Why did people stop improvising? Who knows, you know? But sometimes, I mean, but even with a chart, you want to really understand the meaning of the chords and what they are, because then if you go away from them, you know what you're relating to. So that means you do have to work pretty hard. I'm not answering your question well, but I just
that's good. No, that's good. I do recognize the sort of artificial nature of the division I was setting up. I just wanted to hear what you would say about it. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, the reason I believe in live performance is that it is a little bit different every time. And if we didn't think that, we would just make some recordings and basically that's all we would do. So it is the immediacy, it's the audience, it's the acoustics, and especially as a pianist, I really basically love the fact that I play on different pianos at different concerts. You know, that becomes part of the concert, you know.
I think we're probably going to have to wrap up. This has been so inspiring and really, really wonderful to talk to you more in depth about your work and about your approach to music. And we thank you so much for being our guest at Soundscape this year, and we look forward to when we can all be in the same room together and hear that sound of yours live.
And in the meantime, I've been hearing a lot of performances, a lot of pieces that have been very, very exciting, and well, I can't wait for tomorrow evening. So thank you for having me.